The situation in the Middle East is really heating up, and it's not just a local issue anymore. We're seeing a brutal conflict unfolding between Hamas and Israel, and it's having a huge impact, not just there, but all around the world. This war is now a global problem, not simply a regional one. Different countries have now stakes in it and are reacting to it, including the United States, Europe, and even China. Furthermore, it has significant implications for other international crises, such as the situation in Ukraine. In this video, we're going to take a closer look at what's happening. You've probably seen some of the heartbreaking images and stories coming out of the region. It's a tough situation, with a lot of suffering on both sides. But right now, this isn't just a battle between two groups. It's a conflict that's affecting global politics, and it's reshaping relationships far the borders of Israel and Gaza. So first up, the first major worldwide consequences is economic disruption and potential recession. It's kind of like when you're walking on a tightrope and suddenly there's a strong wind. The World Bank came out with this worrying report on October 30th. They said that because of the fighting, we could see prices shoot up super high for most of things. That's a huge deal because it affects everything from the cost of making stuff to how much we pay for food. The World Bank guy, Indermit Gill, he pointed out that this new conflict is like adding fuel to a fire that's already burning. We're still dealing with the fallout from Russia's war with Ukraine, which has already made things like gas and food more expensive. If the Israel-Hamas situation gets worse, it's like we're getting hit with a double whammy, two big problems at the same time. It's a scary thought because it's not just about one part of the world. It's like a domino effect that can make the whole global economy wobble, maybe even fall into a recession, which is when everything in the economy goes downhill for a while. Next thing we should be worried about is spike in oil prices. One of the big things everyone's worried about is the price of oil. If this conflict gets even worse, we might see oil prices skyrocket, maybe up to $150 for every barrel. Now you might wonder, why does that matter to me? Well, when oil prices go way up, it's like a shockwave that hits the whole world. It's not just about filling up your car with gas becoming more expensive. It impacts businesses too, from airlines to manufacturing companies. They all need oil, and if it's super expensive, they might pass that cost on to us, the customers. So, we could end up paying more for like plane tickets and all sorts of products. Apart from that, when oil prices jump like that, it can slow down the whole world's economy. Think of the world economy like a big engine. Oil is the fuel that keeps it running smoothly. If that fuel gets too pricey, the engine doesn't run as well. Next impact is regional instability. So nearby, there are countries like Lebanon and Syria, and they're kind of like the neighbors who can hear the loud argument next door and might decide to join in. Lebanon and Syria have got groups in them that are pretty tight with Hamas and might jump into the fight to support them. If that happens, we're not just looking at a conflict between Israel and Hamas anymore. It could blow up into a much bigger regional war. Apart from that, the Middle East is already a pretty shaky region. There's a lot of political tension, different groups vying for power, and a history of conflicts. If this current situation turns into a bigger war, it's like throwing gasoline on an already burning fire. And it's not just about the fighting itself. Wars create ripples like refugees fleeing the violence, which can put pressure on other countries. Or it can scare off investors and tourists, which hurts economies. And in today's world, what happens in one region can affect everyone, like causing more uncertainty in global politics or making it harder to get oil, which, as we just talked about, is a big deal. Moving forward, here's another angle: impact on global inflation and growth. You see, when we talk about global inflation and growth, we're basically talking about how much stuff costs all over the world and how fast the world's economy is chugging along. Now, if this conflict keeps growing and drags on for a long time, it's going to have a bigger and bigger impact on these two things: inflation and growth. When there's a war, it can make it harder to get stuff like oil or other important materials. If it's harder to get, it usually gets more expensive. And when the cost of making things goes up, the price we pay for them usually does too. Now, about growth. We're talking about how the economy expands, more jobs, more businesses opening up, that sort of thing. Wars can put a serious brake on that. They create uncertainty, which makes people and companies nervous about spending money. Plus, if the cost of materials or energy goes up, it's harder for businesses to grow. They might hold off on hiring new people or building new stuff. In a nutshell, what's happening, there isn't just a local problem. It's something that can ripple out and change the cost of living and the health of economies all over the planet. Risk of a proxy war. Next impact is that this war can turn into a proxy war. Imagine Israel and Hamas are like two kids in a schoolyard scrap. But then, their big brothers, who have their own beef, jump in. In this case, those big brothers could be USA, European countries, and on the other side, Muslim countries like Iran and its allies in Lebanon and Syria. Iran has friends in Lebanon and Syria. These are militias, groups of fighters that Iran supports. If these groups decide to jump into the fight to back up Hamas, it's not just a local squabble anymore. It becomes a much larger conflict, with Israel on one side and Iran, indirectly, on the other. Geopolitically, it's like opening a can of worms. Other countries might feel the need to pick sides, which can lead to even more tension and instability in the region and beyond. It's a bit like a game of dominoes. Knock one over, and you might end up with a whole line falling down. Moving on to another big concern here, political and social unrest in the Middle East. Think about a pot of water on the stove. It's already simmering, right? Now, if this Israel-Hamas conflict keeps heating up, it's like turning up the burner. That pot could start boiling over, and that's what we mean by unrest. This unrest can lead to big changes, sometimes really suddenly. Remember the Arab Spring? That was a series of uprisings that started in 2010 and spread across many Arab countries. It began with just a few protests, but it quickly grew into something much bigger, toppling governments and causing major shakeups in the region. Now, why could this current conflict lead to something similar? Well, the Israel-Hamas conflict can really stir things up. People, particularly Muslims, may begin to mistrust their own leaders, or they may become enraged as to why their nation is doing nothing. Keep in mind that the government in most Muslim nations is unwilling to bring the country into the war, but the people have been protesting in their desire to actively help Gaza. If people in other countries in the region start to protest or rebel, it could lead to big changes, but also more instability. Influence on U.S. foreign policy. You know, the United States has a lot on its plate globally. One of their big focuses has been dealing with China. It's like a high-stakes chess game where both are trying to outsmart each other on the world stage. But when things flare up between Israel and Hamas, it's like the U.S. has to suddenly pay attention to a different part of the chessboard, the Middle East. Now, why does this matter? Well, the U.S. has been a key player in the Middle East for a long time. And when the U.S. has to spend more time and resources on the Middle East, it means they have less to focus on other issues, like their front with China. This shift in focus can have big consequences. For instance, if the US isn't paying as much attention to what's happening in the Pacific or with economic issues related to China, it could change the balance of power in those areas. Other countries might see it as an opportunity to do things they wouldn't try if the US were watching more closely. Impact on European politics. Europe's like this big family that tries to stay united, especially when facing big problems. Remember how they all came together over Russia's invasion of Ukraine? It was like everyone in the family agreed on what to do. But throw in the Israel-Hamas conflict, and things get a bit more complicated. This conflict puts Europe in a tough spot. Some countries in Europe have a strong historical and political connection to Israel, while others are more sympathetic to the Palestinians. When the Israel-Hamas conflict heats up, these different views can start to clash. What does this mean for Europe? Well, it can lead to disagreements and tensions among European countries. These divisions can be a real headache for Europe, especially when they're trying to show a united front on other issues, like dealing with Russia. If European countries are busy arguing among themselves about the Middle East, it can distract them from other important matters. China's diplomatic posture. Normally, China likes to keep a low profile on a lot of international issues. They're like the person at a party who just hangs back and watches, not getting too involved. But with this conflict, they're doing something a bit different. China's been pretty clear in supporting the Palestinians. It's a change from their usual stay-out-of-it approach, like suddenly that quiet person at the party starts giving their opinion on a heated topic. This is interesting because it shows us a different side of China's diplomacy. Why does this matter? Well, the Middle East is a pretty important region for a lot of reasons, like oil and politics. China has been trying to build stronger relationships there, with countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia. By taking a more active stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict, China might be trying to show these countries that it's a friend they can count on. It's like they're saying, hey, we've got your back on this. But this can be a bit of a balancing act for China. On one hand, they want to be seen as a supporter of the Palestinians, which could win them points with some countries in the Middle East. On the other hand, they don't want to upset Israel too much, because Israel's also an important player in the region. And there's more to it. China's response might also be about showing the world, especially other big countries like the US and Russia, that it's a major player in international politics. Risk of direct Iran-Israel conflict. Now, here's a scenario that, while less likely, could really shake things up: a direct military showdown between Iran and Israel. First off, if Iran and Israel go head-to-head, we could see oil prices shoot through the roof. Remember how important oil is to pretty much everything? Well, the Middle East is a key player in the oil market, and a war there could disrupt supplies big time. It's like if the main road to the grocery store gets blocked, suddenly it's a lot harder to get what you need and prices go up. Also, this kind of conflict could ramp up tensions between the big powers of the world, like the US, Russia, and China. Each of these countries has its own interests and alliances in the region. An Iran-Israel conflict could force them to pick sides or get involved in ways they'd rather avoid. It's a bit like when two friends in a group have a fight, and everyone else gets dragged into it. That's all for today's video, guys. What do you think about all this? It's a lot to take in, right? Share your thoughts and views in the comment section. We'd love to hear what you think and how you see this situation affecting the world. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Your interest and engagement really mean a lot. Stay tuned for more videos where we unpack big global issues like this one. See you in the next video. Until then, best wishes and keep staying informed.